You'll beg me for bread before this year ends." Chuck said it like a prophecy and a punch at once, grinning as though he'd landed the only joke in the room. The words landed heavier than I expected, loaded with the kind of bitterness that comes from a long-carried betrayal. I sat there feeling the heat of the bar lights and the chill of his laugh at the same time, every syllable a reminder of my bankruptcy, an ugly, loud thing no number on a ledger can smooth over. I had thought friendship meant something different. Now it tasted like ash. We had grown up close enough that people used to call us cousins. Those days felt like another lifetime. Scraping paint off doors for pocket money, arguing over whose turn it was to borrow a bicycle, trading plans about businesses we'd open one day. Chuck had hustled harder and struck luck. He built a real estate name that made people nod with respect. Me, I'd poured years into a hardware shop, every nail, every bolt a small promise that I'd keep to my own life. And yet, when the investment I trusted with our savings imploded, when creditors arrived like weather, Chuck folded his hands and watched instead of helping. That was the sting, the betrayal that lingers after the immediate hurt of loss. My name is Ethan. I remember the bar smell, lemon and smoke, and the ghost of the old music we used to dance to. Chuck's glass kept clinking. His eyes were bright in the way of a man who enjoys a game he knows he can win. "Don't be dramatic, Ethan," he said. "You always were a sentimental fool. You'll come crawling eventually." He laughed, as if he had predicted the future. I felt a coldness behind my ribs, a broken trust that did something to the way I breathed. Bankruptcy is both louder and lonelier than I expected. It is the slamming of a door you thought would never close. It is the hush at dawn when orders stop coming in. It is the small-town chatter that circles like vultures. The polite smiles that turn away once they understand your name sits next to a black mark. More than the missing money was the way people rearranged their faces when my name came up, as if my ruin might trickle off me and soil them too. Old customers who once knocked on my shop window to ask about a tool now walked past without a glance. The mailbox returned polite envelopes unopened. The phone that used to ring with requests was quiet most days, except for the occasional collector. I sold my last brand-new wrench to cover rent. My toolbox, once a small shrine, was thinned of its faithful companions. I walked through the neighborhoods with fewer certainties, carrying a ladder I'd borrowed and holding my chin high because shame bows differently in public. There's a personal hurt to being known as the man who had everything and suddenly had so little. But there's a quieter, angrier thing that blooms inside you when an old friend, someone who'd shared late-night dreams and a tiny, shared pride in each other's wins, decides to turn your collapse into entertainment. When the immediate panic faded, there was time to think. My hands, used to measuring and cutting and fixing, itched. I wasn't a man built for idle. So I started taking small jobs, a squeaky hinge for Mrs. Caboro, a leaking tap at the bakery 2 streets down, a fence that had fallen during the rains. The money was small and the work humbling. Some days there was only enough for bread and a boiled egg, and other nights I went to bed with empty pockets and a house that hummed with silence. The tradesmen who passed me in the lanes sometimes nodded, a few turned away. Pride makes odd bargains. Mine negotiated with necessity. But every time I tightened a screw and saw the wood align, something in me steadied. There's a different kind of dignity in honest labor that doesn't need a signboard or a warranty to justify itself. I began leaving small handwritten cards when I finished a job. Ethan, handyman. It felt foolish at first, like a child drawing a castle with colored chalk and waiting for applause. Yet people called. Word moved quietly from neighbor to neighbor. They liked that I listened, that I explained what needed doing without grand speeches. In those small acts, patching, aligning, fixing, the humiliation began to dull at the edges. I thought often of Chuck. Sometimes I imagined cutting him down with cleverness, a sharp, bright revenge that would make him swallow his laughter. Other times I pictured simply surviving, building something steady out of the wreck. The real plan, I discovered, was neither a spectacle nor patience for insult. It was a quiet insistence. I would not beg him for bread. I would make a new table and invite myself to it. People asked why I didn't call him. Why didn't I speak up at the meetings where everyone in our old circle met and let him know his joke had landed badly? But calling him felt like reaching into a wound. I'd watched him at parties, smooth and confident, a man who treated kindness as currency. He'd mock my misfortune the way others collect stories. Offering words to him felt like handing a sermon to someone who used sermons as kindling. So I worked. I learned how to advertise without a signboard. A careful repair here, a small shelf there, a neighbor's smile turned into a recommendation. I saved coins in a jar that used to hold screws. At night, when the city cooled and my small apartment hummed, I wrote plans, lists, ideas on the back of old receipts. I wrote the phrase again and again until it looked less ridiculous and more possible. Ethan's handyman service. I taped that scrap of paper above the little bed I slept on, a tiny banner for a man attempting recovery. Each morning my eyes met it first. Each night it was the last thing I saw. It became a promise not made to anyone else but myself, to take my hands and my honesty and build again. There would be time for any other reckoning later. For the moment, I had to make a living, and in doing so, make myself whole again. Chuck had said I'd beg. He'd been wrong about that part. He did not know, at least not yet, the quiet satisfaction of a job well fixed, the trust you earn when you don't advertise loudly but do the right work. He did not know what it would feel like the day the same townsfolk who whispered would come to my door with their problems and say my name with respect again. He did not know that sometimes the cleanest revenge is the patient rebuilding of yourself, taller and steadier than before. And so I began, step by small step, to put my life together. The first step was a ladder and a dented toolbox and a stubborn refusal to take his bread. The first job that felt like more than a favor came from a widow named Mrs. Ortega, who lived 3 streets down from my small apartment. She had heard of me through the bakery, where I fixed a leaking pipe. Her gate was stuck. The iron hinges had rusted until the door moaned each time it moved. She opened the door halfway, her eyes searching me as if deciding whether I was dependable. "Can you fix it?" she asked, voice firm, not curious. I nodded, though truthfully, I hadn't worked on a heavy gate in years. Still, I rolled up my sleeves. It took 2 hours, plenty of sweat, and a few bruises on my knuckles, but by the time the afternoon sun slid west, the gate swung freely without a sound. She tested it twice, then turned to me with the smallest smile. "How much?" I hesitated. Setting a price for my labor felt strange after years of scanning invoices in a well-lit store. I muttered a number so small I regretted it instantly. She paid without bargaining, placed the bills into my palm, and said, "I'll tell my sister about you." That night, I counted the money on my table as if it were gold coins. It was barely enough for groceries and utilities, but something inside me shifted. This wasn't just survival, it was a beginning. Over the weeks, small jobs grew into steady work. One neighbor needed shelves built for her shop. Another asked if I could paint a storeroom. A mechanic wanted me to help install new lighting in his garage. Each task was different, challenging in its own way. My body ached at night, but it was the kind of ache that left me proud. Still, the shame never disappeared entirely. On the streets, I met old customers who used to greet me with respect. Some nodded politely now, while others avoided eye contact. They remembered me as the man with a thriving hardware business, not someone balancing on ladders and carrying toolboxes. Pride scraped against survival like 2 stones sparking. But when I looked at the faces of those I worked for, the relief when a roof stopped leaking or a shop finally had sturdy shelves, I began to believe I was not worthless after all. I kept track of everything in my notebook: names, jobs, amounts earned. At the top of the first page, I had written my small declaration, Ethan's handyman service. Each line below it was proof I hadn't collapsed completely. There were days, though, when doubt gnawed hard. One afternoon, I saw Chuck's glossy face on a billboard near the Central Road. Invest with Ortega Properties. Build your tomorrow today. He was in a fine suit, smiling with the smugness of a man who thought tomorrow belonged only to him. Cars slowed near the sign, people pointing, admiring. I stood there with paint stains on my shirt, a bag of tools biting into my shoulder, and for a moment, I almost laughed. Life had turned us into two characters in a play. He, the shining entrepreneur, me, the man who had fallen. That night, I dreamed of his words again. You'll beg me for bread. I woke before dawn, my chest tight, sweat on my neck. I sat at the window, looking at the empty street, and whispered to myself, I will never beg. Saying it out loud gave it weight. The next morning, I decided to expand. Instead of waiting for calls, I walked into small shops, offering my services. Some owners shook their heads, others listened. A few accepted. I patched cracks in walls, replaced broken locks, repaired a fan that whirred itself into silence. My confidence grew with each fix. People began to trust me not just for my hands, but for my word. If I said I'd show up at 9, I was there. One client, a bookseller named Clara, surprised me. After I repaired the creaking door of her shop, she leaned against the counter, watching me pack my tools. You used to run the hardware store, didn't you? She asked. I froze. Most people avoided mentioning it, as if afraid the word bankruptcy might spread. But she said it plainly, without mockery. Yes, I replied slow. She tilted her head. Strange, isn't it? People think when something ends, the person ends too. But I see the opposite. You're still building. Her words lingered with me for days. They stitched a tear I didn't know was still bleeding. As weeks turned into months, my schedule filled faster than I could handle. A broken chair in the morning, a gate repair by afternoon, shelves to install in the evening. My notebook was thick with names, my hands rough with calluses. For the first time since the collapse, I began to breathe easier. And then, one late afternoon, fate brushed shoulders with irony. I was repairing a window latch at a small cafe when I heard his voice. Chuck. He was seated at the corner, laughing with two men in suits. The sound hit me like the sudden sting of salt on a wound. I kept my head down, forcing my hands steady. As I worked, I caught fragments of his conversation. He spoke loudly, bragging about deals, about money moving, about lands purchased. His companions laughed at every joke. I tightened the latch until the metal groaned, anger buzzing through me. When I finished, I packed my tools and walked past his table. Our eyes met for a brief moment. His laughter paused. For a second, I thought I saw surprise flicker across his face, surprise that I wasn't crawling, that I wasn't broken. But then he leaned back, raised his glass, and smirked as if to say, I'm still above you. I walked out without a word. But inside, something hardened. That night, I sat at my table, staring at my notebook. The list of jobs filled the pages, proof of my persistence. But Chuck's face lingered, his smirk burning behind my eyes. Revenge had never been part of my plan. Survival was enough. But now, I began to wonder if survival was too small a dream. Maybe it was time not just to survive, but to rise. To build something bigger than my hardware store had ever been. To build something so steady, so undeniable, that Chuck would one day choke on his laughter. For the first time since my fall, I didn't feel like a man running from bankruptcy. I felt like a man chasing a new beginning. And beginnings, I realized, were far more powerful than endings. The first sign of growth came from something simple, a painted board. I didn't have money for a glossy sign, but a carpenter I'd repaired shelves for owed me a favor. He cut a slab of wood, smoothed the edges, and painted the words. Ethan's handyman service, reliable repairs, honest work. I nailed it outside my apartment window. It wasn't much, but it gave me a strange surge of pride. People noticed. Within a week, a teacher called me to repair desks at her school. A tailor asked if I could fix her sewing machine table. Every job seemed to lead to another. My phone, once a symbol of silence, began to ring again. Word of mouth became my lifeline. Customers recommended me not just because I did the job, but because I explained things to them. Why a door sagged, how to stop a pipe from leaking again. I treated each task as if it mattered more than the money. And soon, people began treating me with a respect I hadn't felt since losing my store. One Saturday morning, Clara, the bookseller, invited me to her shop again. This time, she didn't have a repair. She handed me a steaming cup of tea instead. "You're building something steady, Ethan," she said, watching me sip carefully. "Do you see it?" I shrugged. "It's small. A few jobs here and there. Enough to keep food on the table." She shook her head. "No, it's more. You're not just fixing things, you're fixing trust. People call you because they know you'll show up. That's rare." Her words settled deep inside me. For months, I'd thought of myself as a man patching holes, surviving day by day. But hearing it from her lips made me realize I was building a business. By mid-year, I had more work than I could handle alone. I started hiring 2 young men, brothers from my street who had been unemployed since finishing trade school. They carried my ladders, assisted with painting, learned the small techniques of measuring and repairing. Their energy lifted me, and their trust reminded me of my younger self. Soon we weren't just fixing shelves. We were renovating kitchens, repainting shops, building partitions in offices. My name spread beyond my neighborhood. A cafe owner downtown hired us to redesign his outdoor seating. Then, a clinic called for flooring repairs. Each job added to our reputation. At night, I sat with my notebook, no longer writing scraps on the backs of receipts but drawing proper invoices, tracking wages, and even sketching a logo. The words Ethan's handyman service no longer looked like wishful thinking. They looked like a brand. It wasn't only the money that changed. It was the way people looked at me again. Neighbors who once turned away now waved when I passed. Shopkeepers greeted me with nods of respect. Children no longer laughed when they saw me with my ladder. They asked if I could teach them how to hammer nails straight. Even my landlord, who once eyed me with suspicion about rent delays, began smiling when we crossed paths. "Mr. Ethan," he said one evening, "your business is making noise. Good noise." I smiled back. For the first time in years, I felt dignity settling back into my bones. And then, without warning, Chuck reappeared. It was at a construction site. My team and I had been hired to install new shelving in a warehouse. I was marking measurements when I heard his voice behind me, smooth, loud, dripping with the same arrogance I remembered. Well, Ethan the handyman." I turned. He stood there in his fine suit, sunglasses perched on his head, 2 assistants trailing behind him with clipboards. He looked exactly as the billboards portrayed him, polished, successful, untouchable. I forced a smile. "Good afternoon, Chuck." He scanned my overalls, the dust on my boots, the tape measure in my hand. A smirk curled his lips. "I see you've adjusted. Didn't think you'd be climbing ladders at your age." My men shifted uncomfortably behind me, waiting for my response. I kept my voice steady. "Work is work, and mine is steady." He chuckled, low and mocking. "If that's what you call steady. While you're fixing shelves, Ethan, I'm buying buildings." I let the words hang between us, then turned back to my measurements. "Buildings fall apart too, Chuck. That's why people like me exist." For the first time, I saw a flicker in his eyes. Annoyance. He wasn't used to me talking back. He walked away with a scoff, but I noticed his assistants exchanged glances. That night, I replayed the encounter in my head. Chuck was still riding high, his empire expanding. But beneath his smirk, I sensed something, a crack. He had expected me to be crawling, broken, maybe even begging. Instead, he found me standing firm, building again. It wasn't revenge, not yet. But it was something close. A small victory. The turning point came 3 months later. A large furniture company heard of my work through a satisfied client. They wanted me to manage a full renovation of their showroom. Painting, repairs, lighting, everything. It was the biggest contract I had ever been offered. My heart pounded as I signed the papers. For weeks, my team and I worked tirelessly. We built display units, repainted walls, rewired lighting fixtures. The company director visited often, nodding in approval. When we finished, the grand opening drew crowds. The director shook my hand firmly. "Ethan, you've outdone yourself. Expect more projects from us." My men clapped me on the back, grinning. I stood there, surrounded by lights and polished wood, feeling taller than I ever had behind my old hardware counter. The same week, I overheard whispers that Chuck's company was overextended. Too many loans, too many risky projects. His empire wasn't as unshakable as the billboards suggested. I didn't celebrate out loud, but inside something stirred. Life has a way of balancing scales, sometimes slower than we wish, but always certain. I went home, opened my notebook, and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. The rise has begun. The first rumor came quietly, almost as a whisper over coffee. A shopkeeper I'd worked for leaned across the counter and said, "Have you heard? Chuck's new housing project isn't going so well. Contractors are walking out." I raised my eyebrows but kept my mouth shut. Gossip has a way of twisting truth, and I'd learned not to build my hopes on the weakness of others. Still, the idea of Chuck losing ground lodged itself in my thoughts. By then, Ethan's handyman service was no longer a small name on a wooden board. We had grown into a recognizable team with uniforms, printed invoices, and steady contracts. The two brothers I'd hired now trained younger boys, and I had started renting a small workshop for storing tools and supplies. My phone buzzed constantly with requests. Some I had to turn down because we couldn't cover them all. Success came slowly, but it was steady. That steadiness became our strength. Then came the day Chuck called me. I was in the workshop, sorting nails and screws into labeled boxes, when my phone rang. The name on the screen made me freeze. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. But when I answered, his voice was unmistakable. "Ethan," he said too smoothly. "Busy." I swallowed. "Always." He chuckled. "I'll keep it short. I need some urgent repairs at one of my offices. Thought of you." The irony stung. Months ago, he mocked me for fixing shelves. Now he needed those very hands. Part of me wanted to hang up. Another part wanted to see the look on his face when I walked in. "Send the address," I said. The office was on the third floor of a half-finished building. Cracks ran along the ceiling. Water stains blotched the corners. It looked nothing like the empire his billboards promised. Chuck greeted me in a crisp suit, though his tie was loose, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He tried to cover it with bravado. "Ethan," he said loudly, as if the room needed convincing. "Good to see you again." I looked around, running my hand over the damp wall. "This isn't just a repair job. You've got structural issues. Water's seeping from the roof." His jaw tightened. "Just fix it. I'll pay." I met his eyes. For the first time, I saw something beneath his confidence. Panic, quickly masked but real. He wasn't the untouchable mogul anymore. He was a man patching holes, the way I once had. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded. "We'll handle it." Working on Chuck's office was a strange experience. My men treated it like any other job, but for me, every nail hammered was a reminder of how far I'd come. Chuck hovered, barking orders at his staff, snapping at phone calls. He looked restless, like a man trying to hold sand in his fists. At one point, when we broke for lunch, he pulled me aside. His voice was quieter now. "You've done well for yourself, Ethan," he admitted reluctantly. "I didn't expect this." I wiped my hands on a rag. "Neither did I. But here we are." He laughed without humor. "Life's funny." I wanted to tell him it wasn't life, it was choices. But I held my tongue. Over the next months, the cracks in his empire widened. Suppliers refused deliveries because payments were delayed. A big bank pulled out of financing one of his projects. Rumors spread faster than truth. Corruption, fraud, incompetence. People said everything. Meanwhile, my business thrived. We were hired to renovate an entire office block, then to maintain a chain of grocery stores. My men worked in teams, and I began focusing on planning, networking, managing growth. The boy who once carried a ladder through back streets had become the man signing contracts in conference rooms. It was humbling, but it was also powerful. The contrast between us became impossible to ignore. One evening, I walked past a billboard where Chuck's smiling face once advertised new estates. The board was still there, but the poster was peeling, faded by sun and rain. People passed without looking up. It was as if his shine had dimmed. That same week, Clara, the bookseller, invited me again for tea. She had followed my progress quietly, always encouraging. "You've built more than a business," she said. "You've built a reputation. That's something money alone can't buy." I smiled, though I felt the weight of her words. She was right. My rise wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about earning back the respect I thought I'd lost forever. Still, Chuck's shadow loomed. One night, after finishing a renovation project, I received a message from him. It was short. "We need to talk. Urgent." I stared at the screen for a long time. The man who once promised I'd beg him for bread was now reaching out to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sat at my table, notebook open, staring at the words written months ago. The rise has begun. Now it seemed the fall had found its way to Chuck. When I finally agreed to meet him, it was in a quiet cafe, different from the loud bar where he had once mocked me. He arrived late, his suit wrinkled, his face pale. The arrogance had drained from his posture. He leaned forward, speaking low. "Ethan, I need help. Investors are pulling out. Projects are stalling. I can't keep up." I listened in silence, remembering his laughter, his prophecy. "You'll beg me for bread." And here he was, not begging for bread, but for something far heavier, rescue. My chest tightened with conflicting emotions, anger, pity, satisfaction, sadness. The balance had shifted completely. For years, I had dreamed of this moment. But sitting across from him now, I realized the choice ahead wasn't just about revenge or forgiveness. It was about who I had become. As I left the cafe that night, the city lights blurred around me. My mind swirled with memories of bankruptcy, of carrying ladders, of building again from nothing. Chuck's downfall was real, and my rise undeniable. But what I would do with this new power, that was the question life had placed squarely in my hands. When I got home from that meeting with Chuck, I didn't sleep. His voice kept replaying in my mind, once loud and mocking, now shaky, desperate. He had been the man on top, the one everyone envied. And now, here he was drowning, reaching for me. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the shadows crawling across the wall. Clara's words echoed, "You've built more than a business. You've built a reputation." The question was simple but heavy. What kind of reputation did I want to leave behind? The next morning, I walked into my workshop, and my men greeted me with nods and smiles. They looked up to me, not just for wages, but for guidance, for a sense of direction. That day, as I supervised a renovation project, one of the younger boys, David, asked me a question that cut deeper than he knew. "Sir, is it true Mr. Chuck's company is failing?" I hesitated. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "People are talking. They say you beat him, that now you're the big man." I looked at the boy, no older than 18, with dust on his clothes and hope in his eyes. To him, life was still unfolding. He was learning what strength looked like. I sighed. It's not about beating someone. It's about building something worth standing on. But the truth was, it did feel like victory. I'd be lying to myself if I said it didn't. Later that week, Chuck called again. This time, he didn't bother with pretense. His voice cracked. "Ethan, I'm losing everything. Investors won't touch me. Clients have pulled out. The banks are circling. I don't know who else to turn to." I closed my eyes, remembering the night he had told me I'd beg for bread. How the whole bar had laughed while I walked away, my dignity in tatters. Now the laughter was gone. I spoke slowly. "Chuck, what do you want from me?" "Partnership," he said quickly. "You've got a good name now. People trust you. If we joined forces, maybe I could salvage something." The old Ethan, the one still burning from humiliation, would have said no without a second thought. He would have let karma finish its work. But the man I had become knew better. Revenge might taste sweet in the moment, but bitterness lingers long after. Mercy, though, it leaves a different kind of mark. Still, mercy didn't mean foolishness. "Chuck," I said finally, "I'll think about it. But I won't tie my name to ruins. If I help, it will be on my terms." He didn't argue. He just whispered, "Thank you. like a man clinging to his last rope. Days passed before I gave him my answer. We met in my office, not his, because his had already been seized by creditors. He arrived looking smaller, his once proud shoulders slumped. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Here's my condition. I won't be your partner. Not in name. But I'll take over one of your failing projects, manage it under my company. If it succeeds, maybe more will follow. If it fails under me, not you. He swallowed, then nodded. Fair. It wasn't charity. It was business. But beneath the terms, there was something else, a hand extended, not to lift him back to the throne, but to keep him from drowning completely. The project was rough. His former staff had abandoned it half-done, materials were missing, debts piled high. But my team attacked it with discipline and honesty, two things Chuck's empire had long neglected. Within months, we turned it around. The building, once an eyesore, became a bustling office complex filled with tenants. People praised Ethan's handyman service for reliability and integrity. The name spread further. Chuck watched from the sidelines, a man humbled. For once, he didn't interfere. He let me lead. One evening, after we signed the last tenant contract, he pulled me aside. His voice was quiet, stripped of arrogance. You've done what I couldn't, he admitted. You've earned respect I never knew how to hold. I looked at him, not with anger, but with something close to pity. You had it all, Chuck. But you built on sand. I built on stone. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. Maybe one day I'll learn. And that was when I knew the tables had fully turned. I hadn't just risen above my downfall. I had risen above the man who tried to bury me. I had chosen dignity over bitterness, mercy over revenge. And that choice became my true victory. People in the city talked about the shift. They said Ethan, once a bankrupt dreamer, had become the man others trusted with their investments, their homes, their futures. And Chuck, once the king of billboards, had faded into the background, a cautionary tale whispered in business circles. But for me, it wasn't about the noise. It was about walking through the marketplace with my head high, knowing I had survived humiliation, clawed my way back, and built something honest. Sometimes, I still hear his words in my head. You'll beg me for bread. But now, whenever they echo, I smile. Because in the end, it wasn't me who begged. It was him. And that, I realized, was how life had chosen to right justice, quietly but completely. Thank you for spending your time with my story. Feel free to share your thoughts or reactions in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.